Good evening, everyone. I am your bard, your storyteller who tells your tales. I am Akabal, and welcome to another episode of Fabulously Creepy Stories. I see we already have activity in the chat going on. Welcome, little tree. And so you know that badge means that you are a subscriber. I believe someone gifted it to you the other night. And welcome, Star King, and Pepper Tea as well. Ah, Azarus, welcome as well. Tonight we have quite the creepy stories to tell. But first, I would like to begin with an excerpt that was given to me by Cranky Pants. Now, if you have any short, creepy lines, memes, or just an odd sentence you would like me to speak, be sure to join us on Discord and leave the line in our creepy channel, and yours might be read on an episode of Fabulously Creepy Stories. Cranky Pants sends us, "My sister says my mommy killed her. Mommy says that I don't have a sister." Well, I believe neither of them are wrong in either aspect. Now, let us begin with a very short story tonight. This is called Guardians, written by Dark Alligator. He awoke to the huge, insect-like creatures looming over his bed and screamed his lungs out. They hastily left the room, and he stayed up all night, shaken and wondering if it had been a dream. The next morning, there was a trap at the door. Gathering his courage, he opened to see one of them gently placing a plate filled with fried breakfast on the floor, and retreated to a safe distance. Bewildered, he accepted the gift. The creatures chittered excitedly. This happened every day for a few weeks. At first, he was worried they were fattening him up, but after a particularly greasy breakfast left him clutching his chest from heartburn, they were replaced with fresh fruit. As well as cooking, they poured hot, steamy baths for him, and even tucked him into bed at night. It was bizarre. One night, he awoke to gunshots and screaming. He raced downstairs to find a decapitated burglar being devoured by the insects. He was sickened, but disposed of the remains as best he could. He knew that they had just been protecting him. One morning, the creatures wouldn't let him leave his room. He lay down, confused, but trusting as they ushered him back into bed. Whatever their motives, they weren't going to hurt him. Hours later, a burning pain spread throughout his body. It felt like his stomach was filled with razor wire. The insects chittered as he spasmed and moaned. It was only when he felt the terrible squirming feeling beneath his skin that he realized the insects hadn't been protecting him. They had been protecting their young. Oh, sometimes children can be such pests, can't they? Ah, Star King, the volume is fine. Oh, I see we was having audio issues before. If you have any audio issues, please let me know. This setup is still in experiment mode. It seems every week we always have a new issue to deal with. Now let's see. Let's move on to the next story. We did have some technical issues earlier today, so telling these stories might be a bit odd, but I will try to do my best. Leave that down there. Now, this next story is called "I Went to a Funeral That Was Supposed to Be a Wedding." This is written by Mika Edwards, and you can find this story on Creepypasta. This story was actually recently released just a couple days ago. So let's begin. I was supposed to be at my friend's wedding this weekend. And the thing is, maybe I was there. Only I'm pretty sure it was cancelled. I went to the bride's funeral, but let me back up. I knew both Alden and Petra from college. They met in Intro to Shakespeare, sophomore year, and hit it off immediately. They were both dramatic types, so their relationship was pretty entertaining for all of us. You know the type I mean, right? Nothing was ever middle of the road. things were always either fantastic or ruined, nothing in between. I guess not everyone finds that stuff entertaining, because a bunch of folks cycled in and out of our circle of friends. But I thought it was like a live action soap opera, and I loved it. They broke up maybe half a dozen of times before graduation, always with tears and slammed doors and handwritten notes proclaiming betrayal. But they always got back together about half a dozen times now. And when they were all throwing our caps in the air, they had their arms around each other, smiling and laughing and swearing to spend their lives together. After graduation, I moved out of town and Petra moved in with Alden. I would have thought they moved in together where they were going to be in close proximity all the time would have just doomed them. Maybe not having an audience for their drama calmed them down though. Or maybe I just heard about it less. I don't know. We still kept in touch online, of course. But it's not the same as having someone right there in the hall in the dorm with you. As far as I could tell, they both calmed down and were doing great together. Alden proposed to Petra on the first anniversary of our college graduation in this big display. It was super cute. He took her to the movies and got them to play the proposal right before the trailers. The whole theater clapped. Petra cried. It was great. I saw the video afterwards. So, I got my wedding invitation a few months later, and obviously I was coming back for that. Petra was posting about the wedding stuff on Facebook and Insta all the time, and it seemed like she was going a little bit bridezilla. Alden was mainly quiet about it, but he'd post pictures occasionally too. It's not like he wasn't involved or excited about it, just that next to Petra, he seemed more reserved. Maybe Alden looked reserved was no small feat, but Petra was clearly going above and beyond. I was pretty pumped for the wedding myself. Alden and Petra were the first of my college friends getting married, which was cool all by itself. It always meant that basically everyone was coming back for the ceremony, so it was going to be a little mini reunion. Honestly, even Alden I've seen only in person once since graduation, and he and I used to be really close. I mean, I go and see people more often, but things slipped away, you know. So I came into town early. At the beginning of last week, I figured I'd catch up with the old hangouts, see people individually as they come into town, and then cap it all off at the wedding on Sunday. Obviously, I went to go see Alden and Petra first. I knew they wouldn't have a lot of time, but I wanted to say hi. I was shocked by how Petra looked. She was always thin in college, but like gracefully, willowily thin. Now she looked drained, even frail. I gave her a big hug and tried to hide my initial reaction, but she clearly noticed. "So I don't look so good, huh?" she asked wearily. "No. I mean, you look great, just... You doing okay?" "Yeah, I'll be fine. This came down to something a couple weeks ago. I mainly just ticked off that I'm going to be sick at my wedding." "A little makeup, you'll do fine," I told her. She smiled, and even through the illness, she looked radiant. "I'm not worried about it. Nothing's taking this day away from me." That was Monday. On Wednesday, I got the news that Petra had been rushed to the hospital. She collapsed at dinner. They said she'd been coughing up blood. She was unresponsive when they got her to the hospital. She hung in there for most of the day, getting steadily weaker. I stopped by in the middle of the day to see her. Alden was there, holding her limp hand. He looked like he's been there all night. "How's she doing?" I asked. "Not good. They don't know what's wrong. Nothing's working, I think. I'm afraid." His voice broke and he clutched her hand for the moment, composing himself. "I'm afraid I'm going to lose her." I stayed for a bit, trying to think of helpful things to say or at least be a friendly presence for Alden. Then one of the machines started beeping and a nurse came in a fuss with her, so I slipped out. I thought about catching an early flight home. The wedding clearly wasn't going to happen. Petra died Thursday night. Alden was in shock. I came to the house as soon as I heard, and he was there, surrounded by family. His staring eyes, his pale face. He looked almost as bad as Petra had. Do you need me to do anything for you? I asked. Let people know. Call things off. No. Don't call anything off. Let people know, definitely. But I hope they'll come anyway. We'll still be celebrating her life this weekend. Not how I wanted, but they should still be here for her. Most people did still come. Tickets were already bought, after all, and plans were set. They held the funeral in the wedding hall, since they already rented it. It was a much more somber affair than everybody had been expected that previous week, but it was still beautiful in its own way. A lot of people shared nice memories of Petra. Alden gave a really touching speech. Everyone's heart broke for him. The timing of it all added to the tragedy of the situation. We buried Petra after the ceremony. A few of us went out for quiet drinks just to reminisce for a bit. But there really wasn't much else to say. I had a red-eye flight home, so after the bar I caught the ride to the airport, hopped on my plane, and settled for the trip home. Suddenly, I wasn't on the plane anymore. I was back in the wedding hall. Only it was actually decorated for a wedding this time. Alden was standing at the altar looking fantastic in his tuxedo. His groomsmen were lined up behind him. They were all smiling, but Alden looked slightly confused, like he wasn't quite sure how he'd gotten there. The bride's processional started playing, and I rose to my feet along with the rest of the guests. Turning to the back of the hall, Petra came walking down the aisle, one stately step at a time. Her gown trailed behind her, cascading down like a snowfall. Her veil covered her face, but I could see her eyes fixed straight ahead, locked on Alden. I heard a strangled yelp from behind me and half turned to see who's made it. At the altar, Alden was struggling in the grip of two of his groomsmen. "Let me go!" he hissed. His whisper carried through the vaulted hall, and more heads turned to look. "Guys, come on! Let me go!" "No chance, Alden," came an answering whisper. I turned back. Petra was much closer to me now, and I could see details I hadn't before. The flowers of her bouquet were wilted and drooping. Her hands that held them were skeleton thin. In places, Petra's skin was torn, revealing desiccated muscle and an occasional glimpse of bone. Beneath her gossamer veil, her face was rotted and decaying, but her eyes burned bright, pinning Alden with her gaze. "You promised me this, Alden." The whisper carried over the music, and she took a measured step forward. "You proposed to me." Another step. Her bridesmen moved in time, smiles locked on their faces. Their eyes were wide with terror. "You let me believe." Step. I tried to move. I couldn't. All I could do was watch. "You poisoned me, Alden." Step. She was at the foot of the altar now, just one small step up separating her from Alden. He stared in fear, still writhing against the iron grip of his groomsmen. "You killed me." Step. And she was in front of him. Alden opened his mouth to say something, but she placed one thin finger against his lips. "Nothing's taken this day away from me." She took the back of her head in one hand. With the other, she slowly reached up and lifted her veil. I woke with Alden's screaming echoing in my head. Apparently I screamed as well, as my seatmate was staring at me, and the flight attendant was rushing over. I apologized and told him I was fine, and we laughed it off. That was Monday. I've been trying to reach Alden since then. No one's heard from him. And yeah, maybe he's just taking some time alone, which would be pretty reasonable. Except I heard that Petra's parents were having her exhumed for a tox screen, and everyone just seems a little more worried about him than you expect. I kinda just want to ask anyone else if they had the same dream, or if everyone else did. But then again, I don't know if I really want to answer. And that's the end of our first tale. Oh, I recall once I almost got married. She was quite the beautiful bride, or I believe what people will say now, she was very hot. I had to enter this joke somewhere, but it slipped my mind. I'm sure I will recall it after the episode, as it often happens. Ah, yes, it was a cremation joke, but bunch. Now, before we start our next tale, it is going to be quite the long tale, so if you want a break to get a drink, be sure to do it now. And while you drink, let's see what has been going on in chat. Let's see. Spasmy Moans. I see. And welcome to the stream, Amber Jur. And thank you for the lemon pepper tea. It is very much appreciated. Yes, Nater, that is how I feel when I forget my lines. Especially when I practice them. Now, if you all have your drink in hand, and have been relieved in the restroom, because as I said, this next tale is quite the long one. And we will not be taking breaks. At least I don't plan to. This next tale is called Turn It Off, written by Poland Chill. This is one of the top rated stories you could find on Creepypasta. So let's begin. I rested my arms behind my head, skimmed reading the credits of a movie I just watched. After seeing them through about halfway, I lifted myself from the sofa and walked to the kitchen, stretching my arms out above me. I opened the fridge door and found a full carton of juice, so I sat down on the kitchen counter with the window open, cracked just a bit, opened the lid, and took several long, noisy gulps. When I couldn't drink anymore, I gasped to let in the new air and wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. My evenings were uneventful around this time in the summer. It was 9:15 p.m. on a Saturday in July. School was out for the holidays and my parents had gone to visit my aunt and uncle who lived by the coast. They would still be gone for 2 more weeks. I declined the invitation to join them. I didn't dislike the place or my relatives, but we usually stayed there so long that I missed most of the summer break, and I'd truthfully rather spend time with my friends in town. I was a good kid, who knew how to wash clothes and use the oven, and generally not an idiot, so they let me stay in the house so long that I'd keep it clean. As I sat, I looked in the garden and checked for anything scary in the dark. It was empty and blank. I kind of wish we had a pet. A dog or a cat would be nice about now. But their hair always made me sneeze and my eyes go red and itchy. With that in mind, my dad said no, even though I wouldn't mind it. 9:22 p.m. I put the rest of the juice carton back into the fridge door and went back over to the window, hoisting myself onto the counter again. I glanced out at the garden and identified the shadows one by one to make sure everything was all in place. The bushes were there in their usual shape. 2 small trees stood together by the back of the fence, and a metal table with 4 chairs sat casually on the patio. I like to check these things, which is largely why I wasn't scared of the dark. I would always get up to investigate small noises in the night, and I hated sleeping on my face to the wall. If someone was in the room at night, I'd rather know about it, so at least there was the faintest chance of getting away somehow. This meant that my worries were quickly put to rest as I either found nothing downstairs but the radiator popping with the heat, or opened my eyes to see an empty bedroom. Not knowing what could be making out an odd noise coming from the kitchen, or on the stairs, or in my room is what makes my skin creep. 9:30 p.m. I got down from the counter and wandered back into the living room to turn off the TV, and decided to take the rest of the juice upstairs. I went back into the kitchen, opened the fridge door, and stopped, turning my head to focus outside. I could see someone was standing there in the garden. I shut the fridge door and turned off the lights so they couldn't see me easily. I moved slowly to lean on the kitchen counter and get a better look. All the doors were locked and all the neighbors were home. I took a moment to remind myself this. Still, my heart quickened a bit as I stood and strained my eyes to see his or her shape in the darkness at the end of the garden. I had to keep glancing away to keep their fuzzy outline clear in my vision. They were standing very still, and were a little thin, but that's all I could see. I couldn't tell anything else. "Oh," I said out loud. It was a garden umbrella leaning up against the back fence. I forgot that we had used it for barbecues. I smiled to myself, pleased that I didn't get too worked up, and went upstairs to my bedroom. I lied on the bed and propped my head up on the pillow, opening my laptop on my stomach and to see if anybody was online. Apparently somebody else was bored and saw my name pop up. It was Chris. Hey, you okay? Chris. Yeah, bored. Are your parents still away? For a couple more weeks. Chris. Why don't you come around? I don't want to be rude, but I think I can't be bothered to hang out tonight. LOL. Thanks, though. Chris. I know what you mean. It's cool. What about tomorrow? Yeah, that sounds better. Chris. Cool. I'll be around about 1. I got some family stuff to do in the morning. Okay. Chris. Do you still have the tent, by the way? We can camp in the garden or something. Ah, a slumber party. I love you too, bro. X. Chris. Whatever. You got the tent, though? Yeah, somewhere. Let me check. Be right back. I got up from the bed and headed to check the cupboard under the stairs. I didn't know where the tent was, but it seemed a good place to start. I opened the cupboard door and started shifting coats aside. Some cardboard boxes were stacked up in the back and might be hiding it, so I started unstacking them. I took out a couple that were easy to reach, and had this stroke of good luck as the tent came into view. I leaned over the other boxes and picked up the bag, and took the big garden umbrella and sat beside it, just in case it rained tomorrow. I paused, put the tent down. It took me a couple of seconds to get back to the kitchen window and focus on the darkness outside. My eyes weren't yet adjusted to the dark, so I couldn't see all the way to the back of the fence. Turning off the kitchen light, I leaned on the counter and continued to stare at the same point. The other garden features began to fade into view one by one, fitting my previous mental image. I wasn't sure what I wanted to see. The darkness gave way to the familiar forms I knew, but after a while, I was certain there stood a figure against the back garden fence. It hadn't moved. I stood there for 15 minutes looking at it. I couldn't tell its shape properly, but it did look like something was standing there. I decided it wasn't a threat. I thought if it was any real danger, I would have been a lot more worried by now. The thought kept me calm, but I also wanted to find out what it was. I couldn't stand there forever. I jogged upstairs, picked up my laptop, and brought it down with me to the counter. Contacted Chris. Could you come around now? Chris. Oh? Yeah, I think I could see something in my garden. Chris. What is it? An animal? No, it's tall. I thought it was an umbrella. Chris. And now you're sure it isn't? I don't know. Earlier today, maybe. I can't remember. Chris. Are you scared? I'd feel better if someone else was here. Chris. Well, I did offer to come around, and I am bored. So yeah? Chris. Yeah, I'll come soon. Cool. Thanks. Use the front gate. I sat there watching that black shape lean against the fence for another 10 minutes. Eventually, the doorbell rang. I opened it and Chris ran in and bear hugged me. It's been too long, Chris mocked cried. Yeah, it must have been a whole day, I retorted, smiling. The torment, he replied, pretending to ignore me. Look, come over here, I said. Pushing him off and walked into the kitchen, I switched off the light and pointed at the figure's direction. Look. Give me a sec, said Chris. I can't see properly. A minute later he noticed. That black thing? Yeah. We stood there looking at it for a while. I half expected it to be gone when he looked. He leaned over the counter. It's just a big plant, or a plank of wood or something. Let's go watch TV. Will you check with me to make sure? I asked. Do you have a torch? He returned. No, I admitted. Well, we could check if we keep the kitchen light on and open the back door a little, he offered. I thought for a second and agreed, but said we should stay right by the house. We slipped on our trainers and opened the back door. Stepping onto the patio, I felt the air was heavy and warm that night. Chris walked behind me. We stood very close to the door, peering at the back fence. Should we? I had just started to speak when he quickly stepped into the house again, still looking at the fence. What? I asked, following him in. I turned and realized that the figure was gone. It was obvious from the light coming from the back door that the fence and the rest of the garden was just as it always was. Where is it? Chris said. If it was leaning against the fence, it probably fell over into the bush or something. I tried to convince us both. We stared out for a few seconds longer and decided that we were too nervous to go and check. I don't usually give into my night terrors, but now they were just beginning to click into my head. Can you stay over for the night? I asked Chris. Yeah, sure. It didn't sound like he really wanted to. He kept his eyes on the fence. We both went inside and locked the door before going to my room. I got out the sleeping bag for Chris. He drew the curtains without looking outside into the garden again. We talked about stupid stuff for a couple of hours and turned our minds off the garden and fell asleep. In the morning, I found Chris' sleeping bag empty. I called out to Chris and he said he was downstairs. So I threw on a t-shirt and went down. Sleep well? I asked. Yeah, pretty well. But I kept thinking about the garden and stuff. Hey, did you find that tent? He returned. Yeah, I answered, remembering that shape which I had forgotten about until now. Well, I was thinking about the camping thing, and that maybe we could bring the tent to my house. It would just make a change, you know? I didn't have to ask him why. I wasn't too keen on staying in my garden after last night. Wait, last night? Come to think of it, the sun was up and I wanted to check the garden while it wasn't pitch black. I asked Chris and he hesitantly agreed. We put on our trainers and stepped out into the garden. I don't know what we were so worried about. It was bright and colorful. The plants and bushes around the edges of the garden smelled good, and there was a bird in one of the small trees singing out for his mate somewhere. We walked to the back fence and found nothing out of place. I looked over the bushes in front of the paneling and checked if anything laid behind them. We found nothing. I walked around the edge of the whole garden one more time, while Chris tried whistling to the bird. It cocked its head from side to side, trying to figure him out. It was a warm day, perfect day for camping. Well, we talked as we filled a couple of the rucksacks with sleeping bags and some food for the kitchen. We didn't want to set up a fire, so we packed some thin hot dogs, bread, a packet of tomatoes, and chocolate, as well as some bottles of water. There's a forest just next to my house, which is actually pretty good, Chris explained. Our gardens both on the edge of our gardens are both on the edge of it. I stayed in a tent there once with my dad for a couple little camping trips when I was like about 7. I remember I was so excited at the time. I thought we were really roughing it like some hardcore mountaineers. Chris laughed at himself. If we got too cold or needed food, we just come to my house. My parents were out, so we were free to run around the place anyway. Yours are away too? I questioned. It's their anniversary, so they're out for the night, he explained. They're staying in a hotel in the next town over. They'll be back in the morning. Apparently leaving your kids behind was in fashion this summer. At about noon, we left my house with the 2 rucksacks, a sleeping bag for each other, and a tent, and made our way to Chris's house. It was fairly close by, and a part of the same pleasant neighborhood. We talked and joked a lot while walking side by side, nodding and greeting a couple of familiar neighbors as we went. It was crazy. It was a crazy nice day. The sun was almost too much. It was hot on our necks, and the trees by the sidewalk seemed to glow green from underneath as the sunlight passed through the leaves. A sprinkler offers us some water as we walked by our old house, and it felt good on my hot arms. I was already sweating by the time we got to Chris's place. We hadn't been walking for more than 20 minutes. We didn't go inside his house immediately because it was so hot, so he went straight to his garden and dumped the bags in the shade. He wasn't joking. The gate to the garden backed straight into the impressive forest. Very tall, thin trees stood high above his house, and continued as far as I could see. Some bushes and shrubs littered the forest floor, but most of it was either grass or fairly smooth sections of dirt. I didn't see how this forest was classed as small. "Looks good, right?" he boasted. "It's awesome," I admitted, opening the gate and surveying the area. I walked out in between the trees and found a flat spot for a tent. I turned around to see Chris and asked his opinion, and paused, a little disappointed. It didn't feel like real camping when his house was so obviously close in front of our faces. "Let's go a little further in so it at least feels legit," I said, and walked back to him and picked up the bags. Chris objected to carrying his heavy stuff any further. We walked in a straight line from Chris's house and kept checking behind us until the house was just about obscured by the trees in front of each other. We had only gone a very short way, but the forest was already thick and green. There was even a long rope swing hanging from one of the trees, but it looked too old to hold our weight. So we decided to keep our spines unbroken and give it a miss. I unpacked the tent and set it up with Chris's help, and we threw our sleeping bags inside. I lay down inside and tested out. It was so warm and humid, I had to adjust my breathing for a second. I stepped out again and asked Chris if he had a torch for the evening. "I can do better than that," was his response, and he took off towards his house. It was too hot to run after him, so I opened the rucksack and cracked open a water bottle, downing half of it and putting the rest back into the pack. I lay down on the patch of grass and looked up at the canopy. The leaves were shifting gently in the breeze. I couldn't feel from down here, and I watched them sway in the mesh together until I heard Chris return. "Did you get a torch?" I asked, closing my eyes. The sun shone through my eyelids and colored my vision red. I listened to the soft sound of his footsteps on the grass as he walked past me towards the rope swing. "That's not going to hold you," I warned as I heard him tug the branch with a small creak. He tugged it and it creaked in response. I listened. He tugged it once more, and again. There was a moment of silence, and I guess he was still weighing it up. And then another tug. He continued to tug a few more times, and the creaking followed each one. I wasn't sure it would hold his weight, and I smiled, predicting one big crack and snap as the rope and the branch broke. I waited for some final tugs were made. Creak, creak. I waited still. Creak, creak, creak. "Yo!" I heard Chris's voice coming from his garden. I sat up, bolted upright, almost spraining my neck as I snapped my head sideways to face his house. He was jogging through the trees, holding an electric lantern. I switched my gaze in the other direction, towards the rope swing. It was hanging still. Nothing nearby. I stood up and turned full circle. Nothing in any other direction. "What?" I mouthed to myself, walking towards the rope. I tugged it gently. It didn't creak. I pulled it harder. It didn't creak. My mouth went dry. I jumped up, grabbed hold and yanked it, and the branch bent a little as my feet touched the floor. And still, it didn't make a sound. I kept hold of it as I stared up towards the branches, but eventually, the rope gave way under my weight, somewhere in the middle. and a soft thud fell on my ears as a thick rope fell in front of me. Chris was rattling the lantern as he came by. I've never used this before. I got it for Christmas for my cousin. She buys some weird presents. Ah, I see the swing is dead. Let's have a proper burial in memory of the joy it gave us. I didn't respond. I couldn't, looking up at the branch with half a rope swing tied to it. Hey, are you good? Chris followed my gaze. I thought you'd already come back, I said immediately. I wasn't the type to let things slide with an, "Oh, it's nothing." What? He replied. Someone walked by me and was messing around with a rope swing. Who was it? I don't know. Are they still around? I don't know. I had my eyes closed as I was laying just there. I pointed. But then I heard you shout. So I looked around and there was nothing here. I heard them walk by my head. I felt a bit sick. Look, calm down a second, Chris began. It's the middle of the day. We're 30 feet from my house. And even if it was a person, so what? It's just some public woods. Anyone can come through here. That made some sense. And he was right about it being public. But then, where were they? I glanced around one more time. However, the trees quickly layered up and I couldn't see far at all. I guess it was possible for me to lose track of someone here in a short distance. Okay, I said. Man, I can stay alone in the house for weeks on end, but I can't handle a short walk through the woods on a summer day. That's why you've got me for some muscle, declared Chris, wielding the lantern above his head, and I laughed. We spent the day walking around the forest, and returned to the tent to get some water when we were both too hot. We talked about school and what our plans were for the future. We talked about dreams we had, and ghosts and creatures and that lurked in the dark. Neither of us were too scared of things like that, but they made for good camping stories. Chris told a particularly good one of a woman who lived in the woods. She had the head of a cat, and if you heard her raspy meow, that meant she was trying to find you. If she stopped meowing, it signified you were found, and she was quickly making her way towards you. It made my skin crawl a little, and we couldn't tell stories after that. The light of the day had eventually faded, and it was getting hard to see, so we headed back to the tent for the night. The impressive heat during the day had killed our appetites, so we left the food for now and decided that we eat it at the night if we got hungry. Chris hung the electric lantern in front of the tent, flicking it from side to side. It was surprisingly bright, and spilled a yellow light onto the ground and onto the trees that faced us. The warm glow looked dramatic, but whatever was beyond the light was hidden in blackness, or our immediate area was clear, but after a few paces the light seemed to stop dead. It looked weird. Chris ducked underneath the tent, opening it, and I followed him. The sleeping bags looked inviting as the heat from earlier had gone and it was too cold for shirts and shorts. We got inside and took the lantern with us. Can you hear meowing? I said, my head tilted as I strained to hear. Yeah, I could hear some BS too. Chris smiled and zipped up his sleeping bag. Damn, I thought I had him. Oh well. I zipped up my own bag, and we lay there talking for a while, and then the exhaustion of such heat of the summer finally got us and we fell asleep. I had a dream that we were walking to Chris's house again, but there were more trees than before, and it was getting dark, very dark. I blinked, and suddenly it was night, with the forest sprawling in every direction. The rope swing hung in front of me. I turned around and Chris was gone. I heard a crack behind me. A feeling came over me like I missed a step on the stairs. For some reason, I couldn't turn around. I started walking straight ahead, and the rope swing soon came into my view again. I was aware I was in a nightmare. The rope swing slowly lifted itself up into the trees and I watched it disappear. I walked over and stood beneath it, where it had been, and there was a rustling above me. As I lifted my eyes to the canopy, a black figure with the head of a cat came hurtling down towards me, with his mouth open horrifically wide. One of his teeth touched my left eye, and I tore myself awake, gasping as I sat in the tent. My back was damp with sweat, and Chris was asleep next to me. The lantern was still on, and I could see our backpacks at the end of the tent. I took a moment to breathe, and then let myself lay back down, my head thumping on the floor, a little too hard. I rinsed and reached for the bottle of water at my side, down on it in a few mouthfuls. I couldn't fall asleep with the glow of the lantern on my eyelids, so I sat up and stretched in the tent for a while. I quickly realized the light was coming from outside. "Chris?" I said, still confused from sleep. He mumbled something in reply. "Chris, where's the lantern?" Somewhere," he said slowly, sleepily, before turning over. Looking around again, the light was obviously coming from outside. I weighed up the options. Either some murderer had snuck into our tents and done nothing but take the lantern outside, or we didn't actually bring it in the tent and I remembered wrongly. That sounded more convincing. So I knelt by the tent door and unzipped it. From the opening, I looked around. It wasn't immediately obvious where the glow was coming from. Why couldn't I see it? I looked up. The lantern was resting 20 feet in the air, hanging in the dark. Goosebumps swept over my skin, and I zipped up the door before shaking Chris. "Chris, please wake up!" He heard the urgency in my voice and sat up. "What? What's wrong?" Chris said, rubbing his eyes. "The lantern's hanging outside." "But I brought it in," he assured me. I felt sick as my reasoning broke. We both looked at the front of the tent. "We should go back to the house," I said, my resolve buckling. I was just a kid in the forest whose parents were away. "I'm not walking through the dark," he replied. Chris was not looking worried. "We've got a lantern," I stopped myself. We looked at the front of the tent again. We couldn't sit there forever. We were getting scared as we sat there doing nothing. So this was the plan. We weren't going back to sleep. We would get the lantern back somehow. Leave everything here and spend the night in Chris's house. I hated being the one to go first. I wanted to turn back, even just crouching by the tent entrance. Unzipping the fabric door, I looked around. Nothing. I peered over the tent behind us. Nothing in sight. Literally, nothing. Everything was black outside, without the light. I took a step out, and it was cold. Chris said the same as he stood right by my side, looking over his shoulder. He turned back and saw the lantern in the air. "Oh my God." He stood there, looking at it for a few seconds, that seemed to crawl by. Eventually, I worked out which tree it was hanging from, and the broken rope swing at my feet confirmed it. Way up out of reach, the lantern hung above our heads. Tied to the other end of the rope, was still dangling from it in the darkness. I couldn't work it out. It was high up, too high for even a ladder. The trees were thin and bare beside the leaves that made up the canopy. There was no way to climb. Picking up the length of rope that had snapped off earlier, I bundled it up and tied a knot, and aimed it at the lantern. I took a step back and jumped, tossing it in the air, and caught the lantern. And it began to swing as it hit the side. It threw shadows rocking across us. I suddenly wished I hadn't hit it. The light made the shadows lean from side to side of the lantern. The horrible, unnatural swaying made me panic. My eyes became wet with fear as it took solid hold of me. I picked up the rope again and lobbed it desperately at the lantern. I missed, and the bundle of rope sailed off in the darkness, helplessly. Helplessly, I turned to Chris, who had already grabbed his backpack and spun around and threw it with a yelp. And it hit the lantern dead on. It fell and thudded on the floor with a crack, but the light was still on. I ran to pick it up. I turned to Chris, who almost cried with relief. "Okay, go, let's go," I urged, and he started jogging quickly towards his house as I followed. We half ran, half stumbled off into the darkness, checking over our shoulders and working ourselves up as our thoughts were consumed by everything that may be waiting for us in the trees. I don't know how long we were moving, but it soon became apparent that Chris's house wasn't in this direction. "For God's sake, where is it?" Chris said, tension taking hold in his voice. "We'll have to find the tent and try again." A couple of tears were forming in the corner of my eyes. They were probably on mine too. But my heart was thumping so hard I didn't notice. "Okay." I took a breath, and we turned around, heading in a straight line directly behind us. What if we didn't find the tent? I couldn't stop myself from thinking it over and over as we retraced our steps. We walked for what seemed like twice as long, before the light finally fell on the side of the tent. We ran up to it and stood close by it, looking around and tried to figure it out, which direction we should go. The silence was like the build-up of a nightmare, right before some horrible thing lurches out at you, screaming. The comparisons made me gag, and I scrunched my eyes shut. The hair on my skin lifted. My temples were so hot I could feel my brain was thudding against it inside my skull. I couldn't begin to guess where the house was. We could see about 10 feet in front with the lantern, and then pitch black. There were no clues. Every direction looked wrong. Chris took the lantern from me and walked in a small circle, straining his eyes to try to see. I stayed put. "Chris, turn it off," I whispered to him hurriedly. "What?" he asked. I stepped quickly and quietly towards him, bringing my face to his. "There's something in the tent." His gaze shifted past me towards the tent, and he stood there staring. We were standing on the left-hand side of the tent, and from this angle, I could just about see it unzipping the door, hanging open. But I don't remember leaving it that way. So that wasn't what was making me clench my teeth together. A few feet away, my rucksack was outside on the dry earth, with the food I had packed now neatly arranged trailing from it. Our sleeping bags were also nicely laid out, end to end, making a line of belongings leading straight into the mouth of the tent. I took a careful step forward so the light could pass more easily through the fabric. I couldn't have been tricked. I couldn't have been a trick of the light. Something big and dark was obviously crouched, with what I guessed was his front facing the open door. I hated myself for not seeing it sooner. It didn't move at all. It seemed to breathe. It just sat, waiting for us to investigate the display it had made. "Turn it off," I whispered again. Chris continued staring, deaf to me. "Chris!" I pleaded in a whisper. A voice from nearby joined in. "Chris!" We both heard it, and our blood fell in our veins. It came from the tent. A slow, strained rasp of a voice that sounded like a parrot copying a new word. The sound clicked across my skin and crept into my ears. The light flicked off with a click that was far too loud. Chris grabbed my shoulder, and I clenched my fist close, painfully tight. We stood there in complete darkness. I didn't want to move, and I didn't want to stay. My brain fought for control as my legs waited for a decision, rooted in place. We breathed shallow, quiet breaths. Blackness pressing in on our eyes like water. Sweat ran down my neck. I couldn't see the tent. "Chris," something said. "Turn it off." My stomach flipped inside out as the thing in the tent played with my words. I quickly grabbed Chris's hand, yanked him to the opposite direction, and ran like I've never ran before. Chris's legs studded alternatively with mine, and the sprinting continued for about a minute. We lost ourselves as we ran through the absolute darkness. I forgot where we were, and I couldn't see what was in front of my face. I ran head into a tree. My forehead struck it struck the side, and it was sickening. Sparks lit up inside my eyes as I choked back the pain. It hurt so much I couldn't breathe. Chris tried to pull me on, but I buckled on the floor on my knees and threw up. As I collapsed onto my back, my head went numb. Chris lifted me up. "Please don't stop. Please, please," he begged. I couldn't reply. "Please, please keep going." I forced my legs to take my weight as I locked my knees upright, leaning on Chris. My body felt empty, and a little blood rolled down my forehead and down my brow. I wiped it away, and I tried to grasp the situation again, but the pain was too much. "Wait. I can't," I begged. "Just wait. Just wait." We stood together in the inky woods, but we could have been anywhere. I couldn't see Chris as he huddled next to me. It didn't feel like darkness. It felt like someone had wrapped my head in a blanket. Neither of us said a word as we waited, but our breathing was loud, and I wondered from what distance it could be heard. Reality began to return to me, and the pain was now just about bearable. I straightened up, grasping at what was happening, and pins of fear sank into me the second time. I started counting in my head. 1 minute passed without any sound in the world. The wind was dead. The birds might be too. Another minute went by. I continued counting. 3 minutes. We were still alone. Was it even looking for us? I reached for Chris's arm in the dark. He jumped when I touched it, but I steadied him with the other. He was still holding the lantern. Good. We had light on our side. Now if only we could use it. I went over the events hurriedly in my mind. The lantern was hanging from the tree. We got out of the tent, then couldn't find our way home. By the time we returned to the tent, something was in it. But then why did it take the lantern to do nothing while we slept? If it was sheer luck that we were alone when we were trying to get the lantern, I wondered just how small the possibility was that I was getting a second chance. I stayed silent for a moment, and then whispered as best I could. "Chris, we need to turn on the lantern. We need to effing get away from here. We can make a run for their house, but we need to see." "No, please, we have to stay here," Chris tried to whisper too. "We can wait for morning if we have to. You can't turn it on." I could hear in his voice there was a sob breaking through. "Just keep quiet." You have to, please." I parted my lips to try again, but as I did, I heard something. A very faint clicking sound from somewhere in the dark. It was almost inaudible, but it was there, an irregular, stuttering, clicking sound. It sounded like fingernails on a wooden table, and it was moving. It came from in front of us. I was sure of it. A steady click, clack, click filled my ears as we tried to gauge the distance. It was drawing closer. Click, click, clack. It stopped. I was glad for the first time in my life that I couldn't see what was waiting for us in the dark. Perhaps that meant we were also hidden. As my dots fired off in every direction, I gave the thing in the darkness the image of the cat-headed woman, and it terrified me. I was just waiting to hear it meow, but my ears were met with something else. "Chris." I tensed my throat and tried not to cry. "Chris." It said his name twice, and I cupped my hand to my mouth. The horrible, scraping dialogue sounded a few steps away. The words were said oddly, with no meaning behind it. They were just sounds that the thing had picked up, and was now using them to catch us in the dark. Chris let go of my hand, and I heard his footsteps plant softly on the grass behind him as he prepared to run. "Don't you dare," I tried to project into his mind. "Don't you make a sound." "Chris, please." It sounded so wrong, drawn out like the door slowly opening. Chris let out a whimper as it called him. I froze and waited for something, anything to happen. There was a long silence, and I held my breath for as long as I could. I couldn't wait anymore. Very slowly, I reached out to Chris and put my hand on his shoulder. Very carefully, we both lifted our feet and managed to step without making a sound. We backstepped away from the voice and didn't stop moving, but ever so carefully, so slowly. I didn't care how long it would take us to get away. If it took us an hour, every step, we were going to get out. Chris backed into a tree and gasped audibly. The clicking started up immediately. Click, click, clack, click. It rolled on, consistently, moving towards us. I didn't know what to do. All I could think of was to screw my eyes shut and try not to scream. As we stood there, the clicking came to a stop at arm's length from where we stood. Silence. Chris, turn it on, please. Fear took over. Chris switched on the light and tore off in the other direction without looking behind him. I wheeled in place and held that lantern in my sight like nothing else existed. We didn't dare look at the thing, but we could hear it. Our footsteps thudded in the grass, and the thing pursued us with a tap, 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 tap. Now like scurrying little claws in the hard earth. As I ran desperately to catch up with the light, the sound suddenly rose up behind me and over my head and in between the trees. This wasn't happening. It was going to drop down on us. I turned. I screamed. I didn't care anymore. If it was going to get out our lives, we were going to have to run for them. We suddenly changed course. The tapping stopped for a moment, long enough for us to gain a few feet before it came in our direction again. My legs were cramping horribly, and Chris was gasping for air. We couldn't keep this up. Where were we? I saw the light from the lantern coming in an abrupt halt up ahead. I didn't have time to stop. I braced myself to dump into Chris, but the light passed beneath my feet. He had dropped the lantern. I turned my head and watched it recede into the darkness. It wasn't immediately too far for me to go back. The thing would be here on a second. Chris! I was crying and sweeping my tears from my cheeks as I ran, preparing for my face to connect with another tree at any moment. Keep going, I heard Chris from up ahead. There's a light. My vision was blurry from tears, but I could see it. An orange glow hanging in the air in the distance. Another one. What was happening? I wanted to scream at him, to avoid it, but I realized it was a street light. My legs felt like I was running through water, but I kept pushing them harder and harder, with a goal in sight. Gradually and painfully the light drew closer, as did the clicking. That thing could move like nothing I knew. I saw Chris's figure pass underneath the street light, and then he was gone again. Don't stop, I yelled as I approached the edge of the forest, and my legs adjusted to the forest floor, gave way with solid footing. I could see a row of more street lights leading up to the right, and Chris's figure was passing regularly underneath each one. When I was sure I was completely out of the trees and didn't stop, I ran under several more street lights, putting as much distance as I could between us and the edge of the woods. I realized after a while that the clicking had stopped. I needed to see where we were okay. I turned my head and looked back along the row of lights, keeping my gaze on the first light. My pace slowed, and the pain in my head and legs came back. There was silence once more, and the lights revealed an empty pathway. I jogged on to keep my eyes on the glow, expecting to see something at any minute, but it lit up nothing but concrete at the edge of the road. Is it there? The question pulsed in my mind over and over, as I turned my head to continue catching up to Chris. I caught sight of something pass underneath the first street light. An almighty shock went through me, and my fears were confirmed. I let out a cry and picked up the pace once more, sprinting between the lights. The image was blurred in my mind. I had hardly caught a glimpse of the thing, but it was white and massive. It almost brushed the street lamp as it went under it. It had a long, upright body full of kinks, like it had just unfolded itself. And that's all I was able to tell. It must have had a face of a face and limbs, but I couldn't have it set in my mind. I didn't look again. The path gave way to more lights, and soon I could see the glow of windows in some houses on either side of the road. I recognized where we were, close to my house by some miracle. A little further and we would be there. "My house!" I yelled, and Chris listened, turned left to the side street and dashed down. With panic on my side, I reached the turn-in and looked down the road and see Chris jumping over the fence into my garden. "Hurry up!" I yelled to him, screaming. Reaching the fence, I planted my hands on top, hoisted myself over and shredded my elbows in the process. My ankles stung and I thudded onto the ground and sprinted towards the kitchen door. Chris stepped aside, gasping for air as I fumbled for the key into the lock and wrenched it sideways. We both flew into the kitchen and I slammed the door behind us. I locked it from the inside and we both sprinted upstairs into the bathroom, locking it behind us. "What was that?" I managed to say in a panicked whisper, wondering if it would get in. "Did you see it?" "No." Chris crouched under the window, letting tears roll. "Crap. It was so tall, I couldn't." "Don't tell me," Chris cut me off. I mulled it over again and again as we sat there. Minutes slowly ticked by into hours. My head was fizzing, all the while I could still hear its voice. That disgusting voice. My elbows and forearms were sticky with blood, and we both looked at each other, the occasional sob coming from the two of us. Our hearts banged in our chest, and we spent the night there, that way. The light streamed in from the window, but we didn't unlock the bathroom door until noon. We crept downstairs. The kitchen door was still locked, and nothing was in the house. I looked out of the living room window. Another perfect day. No people walked by, but the sprinklers were on, and I could hear the birds again. It helped to calm my nerves. "The tent can stay there," I said at last. "Yeah," Chris agreed. We stayed in the living room and the TV was turned off all day. We didn't know what to do, and we talked about it and if we should call the police or something. The day crawled by and we tried to rake our thoughts together and think of what we could do next. But all that went through my mind was what had just happened, not what we should be doing. By the time it was dark again, around 9 p.m., the phone rang. It was Chris's parents asking if I had seen him, and they were getting worried. They had just got back from out of town. I let them know that he was okay, and asked if they could come over and pick us both up from my house because something was happening. They wanted to know what, but I said we both tell them when they get here. They said they'd be here soon. Relief washed over us, as adults were on their way to make everything all right. They would believe us. We didn't lie about things like this. Even if they were skeptical, they'd at least believe that something dangerous, an animal perhaps, was in the forest, and that was good enough for us. I went into the kitchen to get some juice from the fridge and realized I hadn't had a drink all day. I could hear the water dripping in the sink, so I turned the faucet tighter and glugged some juice. As I headed towards the living room, and the water started to tap again. I flicked the light on and realized it wasn't coming from the sink, or anywhere in the room for that matter. It sounded like it was coming from further away. I looked out into the garden, and could just about see a fuzzy, tall silhouette leaning up against the back of the fence in the dark. Actually, the tapping sound came more like a clicking sound. The figure slowly moved away from the fence and clicked across the grass towards the house. "Please." And that is the end of that tale. And I hope you've all enjoyed this frightfully creepy story. Now let's see what we have going on in chat. I know I can't communicate with you while I'm reading the story. That's how these streams go. Let's see. We see some of you are quite unnerved by this. See. And I'm sorry, Nader, if you just happened to have a yelp in your backyard while I was reading the story. Give a man a match and he'll be warm for a few hours. Set him in a fire and he'll be warm for the rest of his life. You're not wrong there, Nader. And thank you for the ice cream cone, Shaolin. It is very much appreciated. And thank you for the follow, Mrs. Duco. I hope you had a frightfully creepy night tonight. And that is all for the stories we have this week. Be sure to follow and join our Discord down below, where you can get more updates as to when we're going to stream. Normally it's every Wednesday night at this time. Tomorrow Choppy will be back playing his Space Marine video game, so you have that to look forward to. But for now, I hope you all have the most fabulous nightmares tonight. Good night, everyone.